You know Max Verstappen. Ice cold, ruthless, almost impossible to beat when a title is on the line. His own partner, Kelly Piquet, once said something telling. She said, "I realize more and more how similar he is to my father." Her father is Nelson Piquet. 3 world titles, 23 Grand Prix wins. Formula One itself once described him as someone who was never hugely popular. Adelaide, 1991. The final qualifying session of the season. Piquet is 39 years old. He already has everything a driver could want. And yet he pushes his car to the limit, burning through a set of tires just to beat a young rookie by 0.2 of a second in a session that changes nothing on the table. Why would he do that? Because losing to anyone for any reason was never something Nelson Piquet allowed himself. That single instinct is exactly what made him feared. This is the story of how he built it. To understand how he built it, rewind to the early 1980s, when Piquet was already winning championships and already playing this sport by rules of his own. His first came in 1981, driving for Brabham with a BMW engine behind him. His second came 2 years later, in 1983. But what makes this part of his story interesting isn't the trophies. It's what he did with the people around him. Before the 1983 title fight reached its final stretch, Piquet invited his closest rival for that year's championship, Alain Prost, to lunch on his yacht in Monaco. And he made sure photographers were there to see it. It wasn't friendship for the sake of friendship. It was a message, aimed straight at anyone trying to turn their rivalry into a personal war. Later that year, after Prost was forced to retire from the deciding race in Kyalami, handing Piquet the title, Piquet stood in front of French journalists and refused to take the easy shot. He said, "It was not Prost who lost the championship. It was Renault who threw it away." Think about that for a second. This is a man capable of enormous cruelty, as we're about to see. But he wasn't cruel to everyone. He respected the drivers who earned it. 2 years later, in 1985, that same refusal to play along would show up again, in a very different way. And it would end up deciding which team he raced for when the real war began. By 1985, Piquet was one of the most wanted drivers in the sport, and McLaren came calling. It was, on paper, one of the best seats available, but the conversation didn't go the way McLaren expected. Their team boss at the time, Ron Dennis, laid out exactly how many days a year Piquet would be expected to spend working for the team's sponsor, Marlboro, doing photo shoots, interviews, appearances, all the things that come with wearing a famous logo. Piquet's answer was blunt. He said, "I won't waste my life talking to people who don't understand racing." He turned McLaren down. He signed for Williams instead, a team that at the time felt like the simpler choice, the choice that would let him focus on driving and nothing else. It's one of the great ironies of his career. Piquet walked away from McLaren specifically to avoid a life full of obligations and other people's expectations. And in doing so, he walked straight into the most personal, most exhausting rivalry of his entire life. 1986. Nigel Mansell joins Williams, and suddenly there are 2 players in the same garage who both believe they should be world champion. No one told Piquet to slow down. No one told Mansell to play the number 2. They were handed the same car, arguably the fastest machine on the entire grid that season, the same shot at the title, and left to sort out the rest between themselves. In most teams, an arrangement like that causes problems eventually. At Williams, it didn't take long at all. At first, it looked almost civil. 2 talented drivers, 1 dominant team, plenty of races to go around. But it didn't take long for Piquet to realize exactly what he was dealing with. Mansell wasn't just fast. He was fast in a way Piquet had never had to handle from a teammate before, throwing the car into corners with a kind of raw, physical commitment that looked reckless from the outside and somehow kept working anyway, race after race. And Mansell was learning something in return. Piquet wasn't dangerous on the stopwatch. He was dangerous somewhere else entirely, in the debriefs, in the data, in the quiet conversations with engineers that Mansell wasn't always part of. Speed you could see coming from a mile away. This you couldn't, and by the middle of the season both men understood they weren't just racing everyone else on the grid. They were racing each other, inside their own team every single weekend. That's when the personal war started for real. Piquet began attacking Mansell directly and publicly, calling him, in his own words, an uneducated blockhead. He didn't stop at Mansell either. He went after the people closest to him, including his family. Years later, Mansell would say plainly that some of what Piquet said about them was simply out of order. Then came Hungary. A technical change to the car's differential became the center of a very different kind of fight, one that had nothing to do with bravery behind the wheel and everything to do with who knew what and when. Mansell later said he believed the team hadn't been fully honest with him about what was happening under the skin of his own car. Whether that was the full truth or simply how it felt from inside a battle he was slowly losing, the damage was already done. These were two teammates who no longer trusted each other with information, let alone with the truth. And here's the part that makes 1986 so brutal to look back on. While Piquet and Mansell were busy fighting each other, someone else was quietly doing the job neither of them could focus on. Piquet finished that season with 4 race wins. Mansell finished with 5. Between the two of them, they had the fastest car on the grid almost every single weekend of the year. And the championship still slipped straight through their fingers, going instead to Alain Prost, who beat Mansell to the title by a margin of just 2 points. Two of the most talented drivers alive, sharing one of the greatest cars ever built, and neither of them walked away with the trophy, because they were too busy trying to beat each other to notice someone else quietly winning the whole thing. Piquet himself finished 3rd in the championship that year, just 3 points behind Prost. Mansell finished 2nd, 2 points behind. Add their 2 totals together, and it dwarfs anything Prost achieved alone. But points don't get shared. Trophies don't get split. And history only remembers the one name at the top of the table. Piquet didn't need to be faster than Mansell. He needed to understand him. And by the end of 1986, understanding still wasn't enough to stop Alain Prost from taking what both of them had earned. A year later, in 1987, the same two men were still teammates at Williams, and the fighting hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. But this time the results told a completely different story. Mansell was electric that season. He won 6 races, more than anyone else on the grid. Piquet, by comparison, won just 3. On paper, it doesn't look close. It looks like Mansell had the better year by a wide margin, and yet, at the end of the season, it was Piquet standing on top, with his 3rd and final world championship. Piquet finished with 73 points. Mansell finished with 61. So how does a driver win half as many races as his teammate and still walk away champion? The easy answer is that Mansell had the raw speed. Piquet had something else. He didn't need to win every weekend. He needed to be there, consistently, race after race, picking up points when the win wasn't available, staying out of trouble when trouble was the easier headline. Mansell was electric on his best days. Piquet made sure his worst days still counted for something. One more detail matters here. Mansell's title challenge effectively ended before the season did, when a heavy qualifying crash in Japan injured his back badly enough to rule him out of the final 2 races. But Piquet had already built his advantage the way he built everything, quietly, and well before that crash ever happened. This is the moment that actually explains the whole idea of Piquet being feared. Not because he was unbeatable in a straight fight. He wasn't. Mansell beat him on speed constantly, race after race, all season long. But a championship isn't decided in a single afternoon. It's decided over 16 rounds. 16 chances to be smart instead of just fast. And in 1987, nobody understood that better than Nelson Piquet. By now, the pattern is clear. Formula One in the 1980s was full of larger-than-life characters, each with their own weapon. Ayrton Senna had raw speed, the kind that made grown men question their own courage. Nigel Mansell had raw aggression, throwing his car into gaps that shouldn't have existed. Alain Prost had cold precision, calculating every move like a chess player 3 steps ahead. Piquet had something none of them could fully copy. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't loud. But over more than a decade it worked again and again, against all 3 of them. He didn't need people to like him. He needed them to beat him. For 12 years almost nobody could. 3 world championships, 23 wins. and a reputation that had almost nothing to do with speed and everything to do with understanding a sport that was never just about who could drive the fastest. And after Williams, that instinct didn't go anywhere. If anything, it followed him wherever he raced next. Piquet left Williams still carrying that same reputation: unpopular, difficult, impossible to fully trust. But his speed hadn't gone anywhere. At Lotus, he won again, taking victories in Japan and Australia in 1990. Even as the team around him got smaller and the spotlight moved elsewhere, the team around him was young, hungry, still finding its feet in the sport. And in that garage, in that final year of his career, Piquet found himself racing not for a title, not for a contract, but for something much older and much simpler. The same thing that had driven him since the very start. At Benetton, he won again, taking Canada in 1991. Then, that same year, a 22-year-old rookie joined him at Benetton. His name was Michael Schumacher. And within a few years, the world would consider him one of the greatest drivers who ever lived. But in the autumn of 1991, to Piquet, he was simply one more driver who hadn't beaten him yet. Remember the question from the beginning of this video. Why would a 39-year-old, three-time world champion with nothing left to prove care so much about a meaningless qualifying session against a total unknown? Because that's exactly who Nelson Piquet always was. 3 championships never changed that. 23 wins never changed that. And decades later, his own daughter would look at a different champion, one known across the sport for that exact same refusal to lose, and say, without even thinking twice, that he reminded her of her father. And that brings us back to where we started. Adelaide, final qualifying session of 1991. The official result still exists in the record books today. Piquet qualified 5th with a time of 1 minute 15.291 seconds. Schumacher qualified 6th, half a step behind, at 1 minute 15.508 seconds. The difference was 0.2 of a second, barely enough time to blink. It wasn't pole position, it wasn't the biggest win of his career, it didn't even matter for the championship. But it was exactly who he was. A margin smaller than a heartbeat, taken with his own 2 hands, from a young talent the entire world was about to fall in love with. He didn't need the trophy. He needed you to know he still couldn't be beaten. His career on track ended in 1991. 31 years later, Piquet's name returned to Formula One headlines, after comments he made about Lewis Hamilton drew global condemnation and real consequences. That controversy is now part of his public legacy, and it is not this video's place to resolve it. But before the world remembered Nelson Piquet for what he said, Formula One remembered him for what he did. Race after race, season after season for over a decade. He didn't need people to like him. He needed them to beat him. For 12 years, almost nobody could. And even now, decades later, his own family is still writing a version of that same story, in a different car, on a different grid, with a different name on the trophy.